For the folks that are still adamant in the wild about like there's no such thing as malware on Macs, well, I have statistics to prove on a monthly basis that there is malware on Macs, and not only is there malware on Macs, Apple is definitely fighting back against it with XProtect rules. So everybody knows that there's malware on Macs. It's just some people don't want to admit it.
All right. Well, we are right at the top of the hour. I just wanted to take a minute here to welcome people as they start joining in here. We got our numbers counting up. My name is Phil Hagen, and I am very excited to be with you here for our 76th episode of Security Operations Weekly. And I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Tony Lambert, who is going to be joining me to talk about Mac stuff. We're going to kind of have a couple of questions that popped in. As you joined in here, there was a poll question that we put in there for you. Please do fill that out, and all questions are good questions. We'll try to get to what we can during the show here, but being respectful of your time, we got a couple of things that we've queued up to discuss that Tony's brought out of the proverbial trenches that we'll be talking through. And if we can't answer them now, we do add those all to a backlog, and they're the kind of questions that we would like to get to in future shows as well. So we'll do our best, but if not, it's not like they disappear, and we've got our team that's supporting the whole process there. So welcome, Tony. How are you today?
Doing good. I'm glad to be here and glad to be able to do a little bit of Stump the Chump in different form today.
Awesome, awesome. All right. Well, without any further delay, let's go ahead and click right in. This is the Mac malware AMA. Ask me anything, and it literally means ask me anything, like I said. So please do pop in your questions for us to take a look at. We've got a few that we've pulled from previous shows with some questions as well, and kind of use that to steer the conversation. But I wanted to start out here with kind of getting rid of the one of what I think is the worst marketing lies ever propagated in the history of the computing industry. And my good friend Lee Whitfield, who is a SANS instructor with me, he actually teaches our Mac forensics class, among some other things. He had posted a comment on the announcement for this show on LinkedIn, and basically was like, a lot of these sites out there are just stacked with people saying that professionals say you don't need any kind of anti-malware, antivirus, or security tooling for Macs. And if you happen to know who the person responsible for that terrible ad campaign at Apple was, please don't tell me, because I would probably email them and tell them what I think. I think it was really just a very big disservice. My biggest feedback, or my biggest observation whenever those Macs don't get viruses, is this right here. So if you're saying Macs don't get viruses, this is what I'm picturing in my head. Just keep that in mind. So that cleared off the table. Macs absolutely can get malware. They absolutely can be riddled with viruses and all kinds of other evil. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, which is why I'm glad we have Tony, who is doing this kind of work on a daily basis with our team here at Zscaler. So why don't you give us a real quick rundown here on what you see in our customer spaces as those top threats in the Mac environments?
Absolutely. Yeah, and for the folks that are still adamant in the wild about like there's no such thing as malware on Macs, well, I have statistics to prove on a monthly basis that there is malware on Macs, and not only is there malware on Macs, Apple is definitely fighting back against it with XProtect rules. So everybody knows that there's malware on Macs. It's just some people don't want to admit it. And so talking about what are the top malware threats that we see for macOS. And this has been kind of a fairly consistent drumbeat for the last several months, something like that, where uh, just like on Windows, macOS has been kind of in the middle of this evolution where adversaries will start using ClickFix or fake CAPTCHAs, all of the good, fun stuff where you visit a web page that might be, have some JavaScript injected on it, something like that. This thing says, hey, prove you're a real human, paste this into your terminal. And just like with Windows, over on Windows, it might be a PowerShell command, it might be something like that. Over on Mac OS, that'll be this kind of curl to bash sort of situation where a shell script or something else will come down and then start executing in memory and then pulling down additional content. And the ones that we've seen probably the most commonly in the last little bit have been MacSync Stealer and Phexia Stealer. If you walk back in time about a year, 2 years, something like that, Atomic Stealer and MacSync Stealer would be, primarily deployed via someone downloading malicious DMG files or like the disk image file, something like that, thinking that they got software for like, free Adobe Photoshop, but they got a stealer instead. It's less about that now. Uh, Adversaries have really realized that they can make some trade-offs here. It's like they can avoid gatekeeper controls that let them, where they can execute malware easier if they do the ClickFix stuff and just use a bunch of scripting technologies behind the scenes to do their stuff versus, compiling and distributing a binary. And so that's really what we've seen kind of this evolution. And as a result, where they've embraced the ClickFix stuff because it's been popular on Windows, it's also popular on Mac. It's also getting really high in our statistics. Uh, Nearly every non-trivial Mac OS environment that you will see in the wild will be faced with something like this. I would say if you have more than 100 Macs in your environment, you have probably experienced something like this. Um, and one of the cool evolutions has been with Phexia. I know we'll get into in just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I'll mention too is the kind of a theme in what you had described there, especially when it comes to ClickFix, is what we tend to see is in the Apple ecosystems, there's this very strong, very formidable framework for security controls. Where it gets challenging is that a lot of it does depend on the human,
Mhm.
and it will allow that human operator, the user, to override certain things in certain conditions. So it becomes very heavily involved with social engineering, and certainly with ClickFix and some of these others as well. There's a big user education component as well as a technical controls. We're going to talk a little bit about detection as well as prevention when we get a little bit further down. So human education and social engineering are definitely big parts of all of these for sure.
Like healthy skepticism as a service.
Yes, there you go. That's the new whatever we're going to call it. We got to come up
Yeah,
with a good
exactly.
acronym. I love it. Cool. Well, give us an insight to Phexia,
Uh,
because to be completely honest, when we were getting ready for this show here, and I'd known of Phexia a little bit, and you just kindly shared some of our internal reporting on what we see on that. Boil that one down for us, because this one's got some novel approaches that are not Mac specific, except in the context of Phexia. I think the techniques are going to expand elsewhere, but give us a quick rundown of this one and kind of show us why this has become such a top threat.
Absolutely. Yeah. Phexia has been one of the macOS stealers that has kind of grown in popularity over the last several months. And it if you've explored very much about the macOS Steeler landscape, one thing that you'll eventually find is that a lot of the landscape, kind of borrows code from other things in the landscape. So, like some of the AppleScript code that you see from one thread will show up in another. Well, that's kind of what has happened a little bit with Phexia, where Phexia borrowed some things from MacSync. And so, like, you'll see in some of the reporting where Phexia is really similar. However, one of the things that Phexia does differently from the other Steelers is they do a dead drop resolution sort of scheme for finding its command and control servers. If you're used to looking at Windows malware, Vidar Stealer does something similar with Telegram and Steam profiles over on the Windows side. And so that was kind of the inspiration for Phexia to do something similar on the Mac side. The first iterations of Phexia we saw in the wild several months ago would do these Telegram profile dead drop resolutions. And that was what we saw in some customer environments. After a period of time, we started seeing the same Stealer malware. Like when we followed the stages later, the AppleScript stages, it was still Phexia. But instead of doing their Telegram dead drop resolution, they were using ether hiding instead. So if you're not familiar with ether hiding, it's a kind of a novel way to use smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain, or in this case, the Polygon blockchain. Smart contracts usually have some sort of storage in them, and you can use the storage for usually it's programming code, but um, usually it's programming code, but you can just use it for just random storage if you want. And that's essentially what Phexia and some others have done is that they've decided that they're going to store command and control domains inside the little PEX storage that's in that smart contract. And as we started trying to figure out, like, hey, is this really Phexia? Is it not? we started going through all of this reporting from Phexia. And back in December 2025, they actually teased this feature, I think, to an interview that they gave and to an interviewer that they talked to, where they talked about a major update will make the software unkillable. Uh, the funny thing about this is it doesn't make it unkillable, it just makes it detectable in a slightly different way. All of this is a trade-off, every last inch of this, because uh, yeah, you may be able to have more resilient command and control infrastructure here by being able to, rely on that blockchain stuff, but that also introduces a footprint that we can detect from the EDR side.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes into a really good discussion of detection, prevention. This command right here, depending on the kind of work that's done in your enterprise environment, you might look at this and immediately scream, "Oh, this is a problem," or you might say, "Yeah, I don't know. What is this? Do I need to look a little bit more closely?" We've seen um, um, even some kind of background processes for security tooling start to make some what might at first look like suspicious command lines along these lines using curl and whatnot. So, this is a great example of one of the detection mechanisms that we would want to try to look for, and obviously fine tune this as Phexia evolves or this technique is adopted into other types of malware outside of that for sure. Um, let's see. There is one thing I did want to note real quick while we are here. There were a couple of questions about this one regarding Mac OS versus iOS, iPad OS. We are really talking primarily about Mac OS here, although there are a lot of similar concerns in the iOS, iPad OS categories. The approach to getting access to that information is a lot different. So we are really focusing and limiting our scope here to Mac OS. If you're looking at those mobile devices, MDM is probably going to become one of your better control mechanisms there, which is definitely outside of what we anticipate talking about here today. But I did want to give a little bit of a nod because kind of the convergence between the two becomes very prominent in the Apple ecosystem in general. So certainly a concern, but just for the availability of time, I wanted to let everybody know we're not ignoring that. It's just it's different enough that we wanted to stay on topic with Mac OS specifically. So that all said, we talked about okay, OSAScript, running that command. It's something that might be used for all kinds of different legitimate and malicious purposes. What are some other things that we can look for in the category of macOS malware? Not just Phexia now, but looking a little bit more
Yeah.
broadly across some of the different threats.
Absolutely. Yeah, so as we've looked at these threats over the years, the common trends that have kind of come through with this have been AppleScript being used as kind of again, if you're used to doing PowerShell on Windows, AppleScript's going to be your analog over on the Mac side. And as instead of kind of trying to do the compilation and gatekeeper and signing and all that different stuff, AppleScript is just an easier environment for them. So you can do AppleScript in a command line and do it fileless, or you can have it on file on disk and still and potentially be subject to Yara rules and antivirus and all that good stuff. Pardon. Um, so some of the things that we look for is like AppleScript process the OSA script with cookies or with some sort of file structure, file names that are sensitive inside the command lines. And that's often helpful for us because that gives us an idea like, all right, usually most folks who are doing AppleScript stuff are doing it for automation. They're not doing file gathering and legitimately in their environment. AppleScript spawning DSCL is often helpful because each of these stealers will try to prompt the user for their password. It's often pretty much the easiest way to get their password. And as a result, when they go to try to validate the password, they usually spawn a DSCL process. Uh, that is going to be your macOS stealer killer detection analytic most of the time. So if you go and you look at like reporting from other vendors as well, like Elastic, they'll often cite this as a common detection analytic as well. And as we start moving into new stuff, how things have evolved over the years, over the last year, more obfuscation has started getting involved. So, like one of the things we talked about in one of the last episodes of SecOps Weekly was some of the macOS dealers have started exploring like character code obfuscation, and that sort of stuff is again a trade-off that's not necessarily easy to detect, but it's suspicious enough in its own right that maybe you want to explore that in a detection analytic because that's what we have done. Um,
Yeah, if it takes too many, if it takes a whole lot of modules in CyberChef to decode it back to something useful, the more and more and more suspicious it becomes.
exactly. Like and there's something to be said about the readability of it. Like if you can't read it, maybe we should take some time to see what it does.
Yeah, yeah, for
Um,
sure. And then there's always going to be that percentage of them that you get that are, oh yeah, that looked really stupid and really suspicious, but it ended up being totally benign for some reason. That's always it's not risk, but like that's always a possible outcome, right? But you have to have the discipline and the capabilities to even get there
yeah.
to see that. And that's actually a really good kind of toss to this. And I'm going to say this and kind of curious what your thoughts are in just a
Mm,
second here. Couple of questions had come in about, okay, like what should we be doing for this visibility? How can we detect this in the first place? And the questions were, we have our EDR agent and our log aggregator deployed across our macOS endpoints. Is that enough? Or besides EDR, are there any other hardening techniques? And I think the answer to that one is definitely yes.
yeah.
It just depends on how deep you want to go. But in terms of just broad visibility, like where's the biggest bang for the buck that you see in maintaining security tooling on those endpoints?
Gotcha. So the biggest so if we're talking for the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest bang for the buck is going to be to evaluate whatever tools you're already using in your enterprise across Windows, Linux, and everything else, and figuring out if they have a Mac OS agent. That is going to be the biggest bang for the buck because if you're already paying for that contract, you might as well use the entire contract. And each of
And it's also
those,
going to make sure your analytic workflow and all of your business processes that are built around that
yeah.
platform are going to be less of a learning curve and less of a divergence from Windows jumping into Mac. It's going to be much more familiar.
Exactly. Like you already have that little bit of extra training that people have already been exposed to, all that good stuff. And the good thing about it is a lot of those same solutions are kind of converging now to where they also have, some of them will have MDM solutions that do your mobile stuff as well. But each of the endpoint sensors that are on the market nowadays, they'll be using something called the Endpoint Security Framework that's under the hood inside Mac OS to gather up process data and be able to analyze it. Uh, there are some different knobs and tweaks that the sensors may make to the ESF stuff to see like do I need this kind of ESF event? Should I mute this kind of ESF event? Different things like those. So if you want to kind of test if you're in the middle between sensors or something like that, it's always a good idea to sort of try to explore some of that visibility. I've seen organizations have things like, even though it's Microsoft, I've seen organizations use Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on Mac OS, and not just small ones, large ones, because that's the contract they had, and it actually worked very well for them. Uh, with CrowdStrike Falcon, I've seen some organizations have really good luck with response actions with CrowdStrike Falcon, different ones like that. I can't necessarily recommend a specific sensor, but each of the modern sensors that you will find in an enterprise are likely going to have some sort of support for Mac OS as well.
Yeah, and that actually we had a couple of questions that were exactly like that. So that was like the next ones on my queue.
Uh,
Questions from Anthony and a note from David
yeah.
about Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and CrowdStrike, respectively. And I guess I don't know. My personal kind of big picture thought process here is some visibility is better than none as long as it's feeding valuable outcomes. Like if you just have visibility and nobody's looking at it, obviously that's not useful. If you're not getting any value on it, you're not hitting any detections, you're not building that into your processes, it's probably not the best solution either. But just having something, as
Mhm.
long as you're able to make use of it, as long as it becomes effective. And establishing those effectiveness metrics is just as an important part of your security program for any of these EDR type solutions as the EDR platform itself. Is it doing what I need? And I think that that's a really good takeaway in general for sure.
And I know there's a small, I don't even want to say small, a significant group of IT professionals in the wild that will say, I don't want to buy this product. I want to try to roll it myself. There are some things that are much easier to roll yourself inside Linux and Windows than necessarily on Mac OS, and this would be one of them. Because like you have to find an ESF collector You have to make sure that that ESF collector can output something to a file or something. And if you want to roll your own with Elastic or something like that and sort of do it, you can do that. However, there are a lot of things that, if you can find something that matches up with contracts you already have that those vendors have figured out for you, you'll have a little bit of easier time and you'll have support if something breaks.
Yeah, it's a variation on the classic John F. Kennedy quote, which is adapted for modern times, which is, "We did it not because it would be easy, but because we thought it would be easy."
Precisely
And
so.
and then you very quickly are like, "Oh wow, I've made a horrible mistake." So it certainly becomes a learning experience in that case. And don't get me wrong, like if you really go down that road of building that, you will learn such a tremendous amount, not just about your endpoints and their behavior,
Hmm.
but you'll learn a lot just about the internals of the operating system. So it can be very beneficial, but then we
Yes.
have to go back to, is your organization going to tolerate 6 to 12 to 18 months of development and process establishment time before you can get something, or is it better to pay that money and get the capability in the near term? And lots of trade-offs coming in there. So certainly interesting to think of, like, oh, would I like to write my own EDR? Well, back when Red Canary started, that's exactly what we did. It's been a phenomenal ride, but it took hundreds of people and lots and lots of years to make that work for sure.
Yeah. Lots of tums trying to get through the heartburn of that.
Yeah. Well, as we start kind of gravitating a little bit outside of detection, obviously without detection, that's a blocker. That's the hurdle to anything else. But if we can detect, then it certainly brings on the next question, which is, oh, can we do any kind of prevention? So, what are some of your thoughts on mechanisms or best practices or approaches for going beyond identifying bad activity that's already occurred and trying to
Mhm.
stop it before or very soon after it has occurred?
Right. Step one is going to be to treat each of your macOS systems in your enterprise like every other system. If we're going to have this in an enterprise, let's policy based manage it. Just like, if you're doing Active Directory or Intune or whatever your poison is for Windows, if you're doing Ansible or whatever else for your Linux systems or Puppet, let's figure out what we're going to do for the Mac OS side as well. Because if you care about it, you should be able to manage it. If you can manage it, you typically have a better step forward at success than not being able to touch the endpoint at all. Um, for the prevention stuff, I know one thing that often gets thrown around in security is like, oh, explore application control, kind of like it's easy. And application control solutions definitely aren't easy. They're always going to be a if not multi-week, multi-month process of like, hey, let's try a monitor mode. Let's try to figure out what we can do here to make sure that the business doesn't just fall over when we start doing application control. If you're used to on the Windows side, like WDAC, Windows Defender Application Control, something like that, the analog that we're going to have over on the Mac OS side isn't built into Mac OS, but it was actually originally developed by Google and then then forked and adopted by some other folks, and it's called Santa. Um, and the really cool thing about Santa is it has all sorts of rule types that you can enable. So if you specifically want to block certain hashes from running, you can do the certain hashes from running. If you want to block based on signature, you can do that as well. So let's say that you have seen Zscaler or someone else pop up reporting in the last day saying, "Hey, Apple accidentally notarized this malware here, and so this signature is bad." You can turn right around and put that signature information into a Santa rule and block it across your organization. So that's something is fairly, I don't want to say simple, it's still a bear to manage, but it's still possible, it's still doable, just like you would be able to do on other platforms. And something that's kind of been a recent, like last year evolution with Santa is that they started including common expression language rules that are these awesome things where you can block based on process information like your command line and things like that. So, like what we were talking about earlier, looking for like the OSA script with cookies in the command line. Let's not imagine if we can detect that, maybe we could also prevent that. Let's put something in place where those common language rules could say, hey, this has OSA script with cookie in the command line. Maybe I don't want to let this run, and then it stops it from running before it even gets into like pulling those cookies off of disk. So like Santa can get into some really cool stuff to be able to do that with the Mac OS things. I don't necessarily know that it's simpler than WDAC or simpler than the other application controls. It can still be a bear to work with, but it's definitely worthwhile, again, if you have any non-trivial amount of Macs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds like it's kind of that it's in a bit of an interesting middle ground between completely purchased commercial capabilities and completely
Mhm.
home built solutions.
Yep.
And I feel like I am absolutely failing at my dad joke quota because we completely missed an opportunity here for something about Santa being all up in your cookies. And I can't find it right now on the fly. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm sorry, everyone. I've failed you miserably in this department today. I will do my best to up my dad joke game in the future.
The hilarious thing was I was talking to my spouse yesterday and was telling about like the Santa stuff here. And as usual, she kind of went glazy-eyed, talking through some of the tech stuff. And as soon as I said, I don't even really know why they call it Santa, she was like, because it has a list of rules. And that was it. And as soon as she said, I was like, oh, and then that was it. Like
Yep.
the two neurons fired.
No presents for you, naughty binary.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Well, Laura's put a couple of the links for Santa and from northpole.dev in the chat here, so you can certainly check those out. Really worth considering. And you know what? I'll also extend some of this detection concept to a really good candidate for folks who might be experimenting not directly in your enterprise because experimenting in prod is bad, folks. Just remember that. But also, if you've got a home lab approach, if you've got Macs running at home, or you've got one, or maybe pick one up from a resale or something like that, because you're curious about this, it's actually a real easy way for you to start experimenting with what's capable. How do you
Mhm.
deploy it? What does that look like in terms of the evidence it provides? What are the rule formats? Would this be something that you would want to consider scaling up to whatever your Mac footprint might be in the enterprise? So it's a really good approach for crawl, walk, run, and I'm not saying anything negative about a lot of the larger commercial solutions, but really don't have that easier, more approachable on-ramp. If you had to pay a big licensing cost for your home lab, this is something that allows you to experiment with that at the cost of your
Yep.
time, essentially. Very cool stuff. Well, we're coming close to the bottom of the hour, and I wanted to look back through some of the things that we had in here. Of the questions, I think we actually got to most of them organically, which is great. Do you have any other big takeaways, or like what's been your biggest aha observation between primarily Windows, primarily Linux, or primarily Mac environments that you've been looking at? I know I kind of put you on the spot with that
No,
one,
you're
sir.
fine. You're perfectly fine. I may have said this. I know I've said this before in some customer conversations, but I can't remember if I said in one of the previous SecOps weeklies. A lot of this stuff follows the same evolution that you will see across operating systems because at the end of the day, adversary tactics are vendor neutral. The best way I can put it because if you look back on PowerShell exploitation, like a lot of stuff from several years ago, you would see like there are some adversaries that would use kind of plain text PowerShell and don't obfuscate anything at all. But then after a while, there were some adversaries that would start doing decimal or character code based obfuscation. And then as things go, they would start doing encryption inside their obfuscation, different stuff like that, different schemes. And after that, after a certain point, the Mandy and Red Team folks said, "Hey, we can obfuscate all the things," and had a tool for that. And so like it gets kind of interesting seeing all of this because the obfuscation evolution has kind of followed the same trend or across like the AppleScript side that we've seen in PowerShell. Um, and that's just because like as time has gone on, you know, of vendors will start fighting back. Apple starts fighting back with those X Protect rules, saying, "Not in my house, you can't have
Right.
something this plain." And so as a result, by necessity, they have to start evolving a little bit. And it follows the same pattern that we see with other platforms because it's just simply what works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's a really good point too. And seeing how if you've got one of these threat actors who is very successful in the Windows world, you're going to see a lot of their competitors or even other team members in the same threat
Mhm.
actor have to up their game in the other parts of the environments too. It's they see a progression of capabilities on the malicious intent side, just like we do on the blue or the investigative side. So yeah.
I love seeing the last little bit of run AIX on Power. Yeah, for some reason, it makes me think about the days of when I was a sysadmin doing like banner stuff in higher education to run on Solaris, and I really want to like a bumper sticker to my other computer run Solaris.
Absolutely. My bumper sticker was IP tables is my co-pilot because I
Yeah.
was in the Linux world for a long time. But when it comes to a lot of what we are seeing in the Mac world, I guess a kind of good closeout point is it's been a very interesting convergence between the not Linux or Unix proper, but
Mhm.
that progression of Darwin into the mainline operating system with Mac OS and how it has become more Unix-like in a lot of ways. So you've been able to get a lot of benefit from some of your Linux capabilities that
Yeah.
play out in the Mac world as well, for sure. So good stuff. Cool. Well, that brings us to the bottom of the hour. Tony, as always, it is a blast to hang out with you. Thank you for sharing your observations and all the perspective that you've gained. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Again, this is a weekly thing. We'll be back here in next week as well with our August Intelligence Insights. It's a monthly feature where Steph's going to come in and kind of give you a great big download of all the latest intelligence observations from the Intel team at our Red Canary Zscaler perspective. Any last things to add on, Tony?
Steph actually just did the stats on the monthly stuff, so it's going to be an interesting next month because there are a couple newcomers.
Ooh, interesting. So we need to work on getting you a movie preview announcer voice. But yes, I love it. So
In a
that's what's coming
world,
next
yes.
week. In a world. All right. Hey, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's been a blast as always. Look for your follow-up email coming with a summary of this and the recordings, and we hope to join you next week as well. Have a great rest of your week, all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.